Hi again. Today's case comes from the heart of Russia, and it's one of the deadliest serial killer stories the country has ever seen. With more than 50 lives claimed, this is a dark chapter in true crime history that's as haunting as it is unbelievable. And before we start, comment down below where you are listening from and what time it is right now. Also press the like button and subscribe. Thanks. A woman goes for a walk in Moscow's Bitsa park and never comes home. Within hours, police find her body, struck from behind, a vodka bottle forced into her skull. But what investigators uncover next is far more terrifying. This wasn't a random act. It was the work of a man who believed every killing was his next move in a twisted chess game. Who was he, and how did he manage to stay hidden for over a decade? It began as a normal day for Marina Moskalyova. She lived in Moscow, worked an ordinary job, and like many people, she often used the sprawling paths of Bitsa Park as a shortcut. The park was vast, stretching over 2,000 acres, with wooded trails, quiet streams, and secluded spots far from the city's main streets. On the evening she disappeared, she left work with a co-worker, heading toward the park. For her, it was meant to be nothing more than a simple walk home. That decision placed her on a path towards something no one expected. When Marina stepped into the park, the sun was already dipping low, which meant parts of the wooded area were blanketed in shade. Bitsa Park was known locally for its dense forested sections, and as daylight faded, those paths could seem almost deserted. That night, she did not make it back. Her family and colleagues noticed her absence quickly. They knew her routine and sensed something was wrong when she failed to return. The search for her began within hours, a community effort mixed with growing fear over what could have happened. Police officers were dispatched to the park, and their work soon came to a grim conclusion. Marina's body was discovered inside the wooded maze of Bitsa Park. What they found shocked even experienced investigators. She had been attacked with blunt force, struck repeatedly in the back of the head. The injuries were not random or frenzied. They were deliberate, repeated with intensity, and showed signs of planning. This was not a situation that escalated suddenly. It suggested the work of someone who had done this before, or who intended to do it again. The scene also revealed something investigators would come to recognize as a disturbing signature. Near the wounds in Marina's skull, they discovered a vodka bottle forced inside the injury itself. It was not a weapon of convenience. It was placed with calculated effort, almost as though the killer wanted to send a message or leave behind evidence of control. This detail stood out because it was both personal and grotesque. Moscow authorities quickly realized they were dealing with something far beyond an ordinary murder. Forensic investigators began piecing together details the scene provided. The blows to Marina's head had been delivered from behind, suggesting stealth and careful positioning. There were no immediate signs of theft. Her possessions were still on her, which ruled out robbery as a motive. The state of her body indicated that the attacker had gone to great lengths to assert dominance even after she was no longer alive. To the investigators, this showed a pattern more common with an organized offender rather than a spontaneous killer. A person who carefully planned what they wanted to do and who carried it out without remorse. The use of alcohol as a lure later became clear during the broader investigation. Many witnesses reported that people often saw loners in Bitsa Park, approached by strangers, offering vodka, companionship, or a game of chess. The bottle at Marina's murder scene was not just a weapon or a marker. It connected back to a strategy the killer used time and time again, both to lure victims and to leave behind his unmistakable calling card. Alcohol was both bait and signature. Neighbors of the park were shocked at the violence. At the time, Bitsa Park was a place families used, where pensioners took daily walks, and where chess enthusiasts gathered outdoors. The brutality of Marina's death changed the way people saw the park. Media outlets began reporting on her case almost immediately. Residents grew uneasy about going into the forested areas alone. What unsettled them most was the sheer cruelty. The idea that a person could not only kill, but attempt to control the narrative of death itself. Police reviewed Marina's injuries and compared them to past reports of unsolved killings in the area. It was not long before a wider picture came into focus. Although authorities did not release details immediately, internally they began to match patterns. Blunt trauma to the skull, rapid disposal of the victims in secluded sections of the park, and the recurring presence of items like bottles left at or inside the wounds. A killing like this one hinted strongly at the presence of a repeat offender. The act of placing the bottle within the wound suggested ritual and consistency rather than a single spontaneous crime. This discovery pushed detectives to comb through records of people missing near the park over the last decade. Soon enough, they uncovered unsolved cases of men, often older or marginalized, who were last seen walking into the park and never returned. Some bodies had been recovered from sewer drains flowing beneath the park's trails. Others had been reported missing, but their cases remained unresolved. The forensic evidence from Marina's killing provided the missing thread, linking all of these deaths together. For Marina's family, there was no comfort in these details. They had lost someone they loved in the cruelest way possible. But for investigators, her murder became the key that started unraveling the quiet cover under which a predator had been operating. Without this discovery, the killings might have carried on unnoticed for much longer. Because of her case, the pattern was brought into the open, where the police could no longer dismiss earlier vanishings as isolated accidents. The brutality of her attack demonstrated something chilling. Whoever was behind it needed more than killing alone. The staging of the crime scene showed a craving for spectacle. To force an object inside the wound was not something done on impulse. It took time and intent. That meant the killer was not satisfied with ending the life of his victim. He wanted power displayed beyond death. For investigators, this suggested a killer escalating in confidence, someone who could no longer resist the urge to announce his presence through violence. Although Marina's case horrified the community, it also served as a wake-up call for the authorities. The press began to report that a predator might be at work in Moscow, targeting people within the park itself. Unease spread. People began taking alternate routes, avoiding the woods at night, or traveling only in groups. Still, for police, the question remained, who could carry out crimes with such deliberate cruelty? And how long had he been doing it? The killing of Marina Moskalyova was not the beginning, though it became the moment the public became aware. For Moscow authorities, the scene signaled that they were not dealing with an isolated incident. It was the evidence of something far larger, a violent campaign hidden beneath ordinary life in the capital. To understand how one man could reach that point, hidden, calculating, and able to kill repeatedly, investigators had to trace his life back many years. This trail led not just through the park, but into his beginnings, where the first cracks in his personality had already started to form. But to understand how he got here, we have to go back. Could a childhood accident rewire a future killer? For Aleksandr Pitšuškin, many point to one incident in particular. As a young boy in Moscow, he suffered a serious head injury at a playground. He had been playing when a heavy swing struck him squarely in the head, hard enough to damage the frontal cortex of his brain. This region, now widely known for governing judgment, self-control, and decision-making, was where doctors later suspected the trauma had left lasting effects. Although at the time it might not have seemed like more than a playground mishap, the injury would shadow his development in ways no one could have predicted. Before the accident, Aleksandr was described as ordinary, even sociable. He played with other children, sought their company, and blended easily in groups. Afterward, his behavior began to change. Teachers and relatives started noticing mood swings and sudden outbursts of anger. Small provocations brought on big reactions. The boy who had once been easygoing now appeared unpredictable. Experts who studied his case later suggested that the blow might have damaged the exact part of the brain associated with impulse control, meaning frustrations that most kids could shrug off were no longer manageable for him. School made things worse. Other students began to tease him, sometimes cruelly. He struggled with speech at times, and classmates latched onto anything that set him apart. In the rigid environment of the Soviet classroom, bullying could be relentless. Aleksandr often found himself alienated, feeling cornered by those around him. Instead of reaching out for friendships, he retreated. He became more solitary, finding refuge not in people, but in personal escapes. The tug between wanting acceptance and facing constant rejection only seemed to increase his frustration. Those humiliations, paired with his volatile temper, created an isolated child who looked for order elsewhere. That order arrived through his grandfather. Unlike many others in his life, the older man recognized potential in Aleksandr and encouraged him. He introduced him to chess, a game already deeply ingrained in Russian culture. For the boy, chess became more than a pastime. It became an arena where control, strategy, and intellect could triumph. Each game was a chance not only to learn moves, but to escape the petty cruelties of school life. At the chessboard, the mocking voices of classmates did not exist. What mattered was foresight, patience, and the ability to think steps ahead. His grandfather, seeing this, urged him to pursue the game with dedication. Chess soon became a growing obsession. Aleksandr often spent long hours studying strategies, memorizing openings, and imagining himself mastering opponents. Some reports note that he displayed significant ability early on, showing an almost obsessive desire to study and replay matches until every possible move became familiar. The grid of 64 squares offered him control and predictability that were absent in his daily life. In a sense, the game became both a shield and a structure. While he lacked real connection with peers, the game of chess gave him an outlet that made him feel powerful, smart, and in command of outcomes. But even this lifeline would not last. Alexander's grandfather eventually passed away, leaving him without the one stable influence who had treated him with encouragement and respect. This loss hit him harder than most expected, taking away the man who had not only introduced him to chess, but also given him a sense of belonging. Without that support, the game remained, but the comfort behind it was gone. Chess transformed from a hobby, guided by companionship, into something darker, more solitary. He carried on with the same obsession, but now it operated in a vacuum of grief and detachment. During adolescence, his volatility grew. The combination of neurological injury, continued bullying, and the absence of his grandfather's guidance made him even more unstable. Teachers saw behavioral issues that set him apart from other teens. He became prone to aggression and sought dominance where he could. He wanted control that eluded him in daily life. The pressure of his isolation, amplified by internal confusion, started to eat away at the thin layer of normality he had managed to maintain. The very game that had once offered refuge became a symbolic platform for his rising fixation on control, victory, and superiority over others. Psychologists who later studied his case often pointed to this period as crucial. The frontal cortex injury alone might not explain his outcome, but combined with social rejection and the loss of someone who anchored him, it created ingredients for distortion. A child who once needed stability lacked it. A boy once cheered on for simple moves on a chessboard lost the encouragement that made him feel significant. In that vacuum, frustration fermented. Instead of learning normal pathways of empathy and companionship, he began associating satisfaction with power, with the ability to dominate through tactics. The unfolding years showed a fragile young man who could no longer process emotions as others did. Each insult at school hit harder. Each loss of approval deepened his sense of alienation. At the same time, chess reinforced notions of winning by eliminating opposition. His love for the structured game, combined with a brain unable to regulate impulses, pushed him further from healthy bonds. Losing his grandfather stripped away the one figure who had nurtured him in a constructive direction. Left alone, the obsession mutated, feeding frustrations and skewing his perception of relationships. While many children face bullying and loss, Pitšuškin's case carried with it the added weight of a brain injury that left him less able to handle stress in healthy ways. Experts later compared such injuries to removing the brakes from a car. Emotions, impulses, and desires rolled forward unchecked. Coupled with ridicule at school, his mind absorbed rejection more deeply. Without guidance, he sought control over the small things he could, replaying chess moves or imagining outcomes where he always had the upper hand. This spiral laid the groundwork for the patterns that would appear later. From the outside, he appeared fragile, unstable, and increasingly angry. To those who cared to look closely, there were clear markers of a teenager being pushed toward darker impulses. The swing accident had left its mark on his brain. The bullying left scars on his sense of worth. The death of his grandfather stripped away the one bond that had kept him tethered. What remained was a young man with unstable emotions, obsessed with a game where destroying an opponent was the end goal, and unable to find belonging outside that rigid grid of black and white squares. But signs of his cruelty appeared long before his first murder. The chilling videos no teenager should ever make began in Aleksandr Pitšuškin's adolescence. Unlike most young people who might record family events or time with friends, his tapes captured something far more disturbing. He pointed the camera at acts that revealed his early fascination with fear. One of the most telling incidents involved children from his neighborhood. Aleksandr would hold them upside down outside of high apartment windows, their small bodies dangling over a fatal drop as he gripped their ankles with his hands. Looking straight into the lens, he would declare that their lives were in his hands. For the neighborhood kids, it was a terrifying experience, a moment of helplessness with no idea if he would let go. To those who later studied the tapes, it demonstrated more than cruelty. It revealed a teenager rehearsing the role of executioner, savoring the control and the ability to decide if another person lived or fell to their death. This was not just reckless bravado caught on camera, it was the beginning of a pattern where domination itself was the prize. After making these recordings, Aleksandr returned to them again and again. Friends later recalled how he enjoyed replaying the tapes, studying his own performance and reliving that sense of power. Watching himself issue life or death threats became a ritual. The more he observed it, the more he reinforced the belief that control over others could provide satisfaction. These were not home videos tucked away as memories. They were rehearsals kept alive by repeated viewings, strengthening the link in his mind between authority and gratification. The young Pitšuškin showed little interest in companionship outside of these experiments in dominance. While most teenagers longed for approval or acceptance among peers, for him satisfaction came when others were terrified. By returning to the tapes instead of socializing, he revealed his priorities. He was less interested in being liked and more fascinated with being feared. This reversal of the usual social desire, trading bonds for intimidation, highlighted just how different his development had become. In Pitšuškin's neighborhood, these behaviors occurred without widespread notice. He had outward hobbies that provided a facade of normalcy. One of the most visible was his continued obsession with chess. To outsiders, a young man carrying a board or playing in the park seemed harmless, even studious. Parents might have approved, teachers might have encouraged him to keep his mind active, and peers sometimes looked on with mild curiosity. Chess, however, concealed his darker side. The discipline and planning required for the game merged with the intensity of his hidden recordings. He cultivated the appearance of an ordinary pastime while pursuing sinister experiments in private. The tapes also showed that his enjoyment came from the process rather than from any friendship with those present. In one sense, the children he dangled above the ground served as props. Their terror, shaking limbs, and screams became elements of his performance. He did not need them as companions after the fact. What mattered most was the temporary state of absolute power, followed by the record that allowed him to relive it. The unchanged repetition of viewing and reviewing his acts strengthened his attachment to fear as a kind of fuel. Experts who later reviewed his background often highlighted these videos as early indicators of an escalating cycle. A teenager who relies on fear for entertainment and control may seek ever more intense ways of gaining it. In replaying a simulated choice of life or death, Pitšuškin was preparing himself for situations where the choice would become real. The camera gave him not just an outlet but also proof. It captured him in command, an image frozen in time that reinforced the way he wanted to see himself. What these incidents also revealed was an unresolved hunger for dominance over helplessness. His own childhood, marked by bullying, left him humiliated and weak in front of classmates who laughed at him. With a camera in his hand and terrified children beneath him, he reversed that humiliation. Now others trembled while he decided their fate. The tapes became a mirror where he could watch himself as something more powerful than the defenseless boy who had endured taunts in school. In doing so, he crafted a personal narrative where fear was the answer to his own inadequacy. The unsettling pattern was clear to anyone who could see past the surface. Instead of processing rejection through resilience, he turned it into aggression. Instead of rebuilding self-confidence through achievement, he rebuilt it through domination. These recordings made private what would one day become his public crimes. The enjoyment he found in orchestrating fear was too deeply embedded to remain contained. In truth, every playback carried him closer to testing the same power outside of performance. It is important to note that many who knew him were still unaware of these disturbing practices. To casual acquaintances, a teenager studying chess strategies in his spare time or passing through the neighborhood with a board looked unremarkable. Some described him as quiet, perhaps awkward, but hardly dangerous. The tapes were known only to a handful of peers, if at all. Lacking context, adults saw only the veneer of a boy with unusual enthusiasm for a traditional game. This gap between perception and reality created an environment where his unusual behavior advanced, unchecked. The notion that fear could be filmed, replayed, and used for personal gratification became one of Pitšuškin's earliest rehearsals for violence. Every time he rewound the images, he strengthened the association between dominance and personal satisfaction. Over time, the powerless faces of his young neighbors acted like silent encouragement to continue pushing boundaries. Without anyone intervening, his rehearsal grew more advanced. The stage of the window ledge, the uneven balance of child bodies dangling over the drop, and the voice declaring control over life and death, all of these were steps along a path toward actual killing. When investigators later examined his developmental history, these recordings offered a chilling window into how deeply his fixation on control had taken root, long before his first known murder. They showed a youth not experimenting with harmless rebellion but staging entire scenes where the ultimate power over others was his to command. For most teenagers, videotapes were souvenirs of nights spent with friends. For him, they were stark reminders of domination replayed endlessly, etched into memory as victories. The significance of these tapes has grown over time as psychologists continue to study them. They reveal how fantasy and performance can become practice. By coupling control with pleasure and fear with satisfaction, Pitšuškin rehearsed the mindset of a predator years before the first life was ended in reality. In those moments, the rehearsals blurred into something more than fantasy. They became training. The obsession with power became a disturbing rehearsal for murder. Soon, fantasy turned into action with his first victim. His first plan already had 64 deaths in mind. Aleksandr Pitšuškin was still a teenager when he revealed this plan to a classmate named Mikhail Odichuk. The two boys were close enough to confide in one another, yet the friendship carried a darker edge. Unlike other schoolyard conversations, theirs did not focus on music or sports. Instead, Aleksandr spoke of murder as if it was a strategy, a contest to be drawn out across years. The idea was simple in his mind. Each square of a chessboard would represent a victim. 64 squares, 64 murders. At first, Mikhail treated these claims as wild, even theatrical. But over time, the words took root, and together the two boys began to plan the unthinkable. By the time they were both old enough to act on these fantasies, their conversations had crossed a line. This was not just theory anymore. Aleksandr invited his classmate to help him turn those ideas into reality. At first, Mikhail seemed willing, perhaps caught between curiosity and loyalty to his strange friend. The plan was direct. They would lure someone they knew into Bitsa Park, an area already familiar to both of them. The secluded entrances and underground sewer tunnels provided privacy. The park's size made it easy to disappear into, and at the edge of Moscow, it was known both as a place for leisure and a location to drink with little attention from police. For Aleksandr, it was the perfect ground to stage what he saw as his opening move. When the night finally arrived, the boys set the plan in motion. They met at Bitsa Park, carrying the tension of an idea about to become reality. Aleksandr urged Mikhail to act with him, yet it was in that moment that Mikhail faltered. Faced with the prospect of actually taking another life, he backed out. Fear, hesitation, or perhaps the sudden weight of conscience stopped him cold. For most, this would have been the end. Few people would carry a shallow teenage threat beyond angry words. But Aleksandr was different. To him, backing out meant betrayal, and betrayal carried consequences. According to accounts reconstructed later, the refusal only solidified Mikhail's fate. That friendship, once twisted around a shared plan, now became the justification for murder. The betrayal was too much for Aleksandr's pride, and in a grim reversal, his first victim became the very peer who was supposed to be his accomplice. After luring him into the park, Aleksandr attacked. Strangulation was the method. It was efficient, silent, and brutal. Once Mikhail's body was limp, Aleksandr dragged him to the opening of an underground sewer tunnel. The park contained multiple shafts leading down into the water systems beneath Moscow. He left Mikhail's body there, hidden from casual discovery. That decision had lasting consequences for investigators. Without a body located, the crime remained officially unsolved. The absence of physical evidence made prosecution nearly impossible at the time. Aleksandr was briefly considered a suspect when Mikhail disappeared. After all, suspicion naturally landed on the friend last seen with him. For a short period, Pitšuškin was under police scrutiny, and he was even taken into custody. But without a corpse or witnesses, detectives could not establish a case that would stand in court. The authorities released him, and the incident faded into the background of Moscow's case files. For Mikhail's family, there would never be the closure of a burial. He remained missing, lost to a tunnel beneath the very park that would later hold so many more victims. For Aleksandr, though, this was more than just the killing of a friend. It was a beginning. The first square on his imagined chessboard had been taken, and the sense of power he had long rehearsed in his tapes was now tested against real life. There was no turning away, no undoing the act. Unlike childhood games of bluff or theatrics with other kids, this was irreversible. The pattern he had planned in his head was no longer a fantasy. It had begun with the person who had stumbled at the edge of the plan. The remarkable detail of this moment is not just the murder itself, but the missed opportunity for intervention. That first killing could have led to a tighter investigation, a grave discovery, and the end of his career before it truly started. But the lack of evidence opened the way for years of silence. For police, there was no proof of a crime at all. Mikhail appeared to have vanished. Authorities held suspicions, but suspicions are not facts, and without a body or confession, the system let Aleksandr walk free. This failure to act decisively would haunt the record later, as the full scope of his crimes came to light. For the next several years, Aleksandr Pitšuškin lived under a kind of self-imposed quiet. He did not announce more killings immediately, at least none that could be proven. It was as if the murder of Mikhail satisfied his rage for a time, or perhaps confirmed his willingness to wait until circumstances aligned again. During this pause, the urge did not disappear. His own writings and later confessions showed that he always thought in terms of strategy, biding his time as though each crime required its place. The silence was deceptive. To the outside world, it looked like nothing at all. But beneath that calm exterior, the violence was only resting, waiting for the chance to rise again. Looking back, the murder of Mikhail Oditchuk stands as a critical turning point. This was not a stranger selected randomly. This was a boy he knew, a boy who shared his classes, his walks, and his time. It revealed how little hesitation Aleksandr felt in targeting someone close to him. The act showed that loyalty, trust, or familiarity were meaningless. Once someone failed to meet his demands, they became expendable. This disregard set the tone for later crimes, where proximity and acquaintance offered no protection. In his worldview, betrayal deserved punishment, and punishment meant elimination. Despite its invisibility to the public at the time, this killing fit perfectly within the outline of the chessboard fantasy. It served as the opening move, the first capture on a board he intended to fill. Even though investigators did not see the pattern yet, in Aleksandr's mind, the pieces were already in motion. Each victim, each act of violence, would simply follow from the logic he set that night. The significance of choosing Mikhail as the first extended beyond revenge. It trained him to treat killing as achievable, something he could commit and conceal. He saw clarity in the outcome. He could end a life, avoid detection, and walk away untouched. That clarity emboldened him. The tragedy of Mikhail's death is not just that it was his friend who suffered. It is also in what it prevented. If charges had been made, if evidence had been conclusive, dozens of lives later might have been spared. The silence following that crime was not peace, but delay. And when the urge returned, Aleksandr brought it with greater calculation than before. The seeds of his long career as a murderer were already planted in the soil of Bitsa Park, and the roots were spreading. His first victim, the friend who had once shared the idea, then refused to act, sealed a deadly pattern. Pitšuškin's betrayal of his accomplice set in motion a journey Moscow police would take years to uncover. For the public, it seemed as though the case of Mikhail Oditchuk was just another disappearance. For Aleksandr, it was the start of his imagined game. For years after, he went silent, but the violence was only dormant, preparing for a brutal return. After almost a decade of silence, the bodies began reappearing. When authorities looked back, they would see that the killings in Bitsa Park were not a sudden outbreak, but a carefully controlled return. By the early 2000s, Aleksandr Pitšuškin decided that the long pause after his first murder had gone on long enough. The same forest trails, the same underground sewer tunnels, and the same sense of isolation that hid his first crime now became the stage for dozens more. Once again, Moscow's sprawling parkland, so familiar to families, chess players, and elderly residents, turned into hunting grounds, and this time, the scale was far greater. His focus in these early years fell on those society often overlooked. Elderly pensioners, many of them homeless or socially isolated, became his primary targets. Some of these men came into the park in search of a quiet space to drink, and others wandered there because they had little else. Aleksandr approached them with simple offers: a bottle of vodka, a shared conversation, even a quick game of chess. For his victims, there was no reason to think a stranger offering companionship posed a threat. If anything, he blended into the regular park culture, where chessboards and drinks were part of everyday life. Once a victim agreed to join him, his methods rarely changed. The first strike came from behind. He often used a hammer, chosen because it could fit into a pocket and leave little mess on his own clothing. On other occasions, he relied on vodka bottles, turning them from bait into weapons. Once the victim collapsed, he almost always finished the act by dragging the body to sewer openings scattered throughout the park. These narrow shafts, leading to streams underneath, became his favoured disposal sites. The sewers hid evidence quickly, and police soon noticed how many bodies were recovered along the park's waterways. To Aleksandr, this method provided efficiency and concealment. As the killings progressed, the brutality escalated. He wasn't content with simply bludgeoning his victims. When police arrived at some of the later scenes, they discovered horrifying details. Wooden sticks driven through the skull, bottles rammed into the wounds with deliberate force. These were not quick killings or sloppy cover-ups. They were staged in a way that ensured investigators would recognize them as intentional and symbolic acts. The repetition of these grotesque markers soon became recognizable as his calling card. What had begun years earlier with the murder of his classmate was now transformed into ritual. During the same period, Bitsa Park remained part of ordinary Moscow life. Families still used its open fields on weekends. Children played on the same swings and climbing frames that filled public playgrounds across the city. Pensioners met at benches to play chess. Yet, within walking distance of those activities, bodies accumulated in drainage canals and wooded clearings. The imagery was striking. What appeared to be a place of leisure by day had, without public knowledge, turned into a graveyard. The contrasts made the crimes more unsettling. While dog walkers strolled paths overhead, the remains of victims were hidden in sewers below. Not every attack ended with death. Several people survived their encounters with Aleksandr. One such survivor later explained how a seemingly friendly man offered him vodka on a warm afternoon, only to strike his head from behind without warning. Staggering and bleeding, the victim managed to escape before being dragged off. Though injured, these survivors carried important clues. They confirmed that the attacker often used blunt force, and that he was willing to exploit the trust of anyone who agreed to sit down with him. What stood out was how their accounts aligned across different incidents, painting a picture of a consistent predator. Even with this testimony, however, tying all of the attacks back to one man proved difficult. The police at the time struggled to see the connection between the crimes. One reason was the diversity of victims. Many were marginalized figures, men with no fixed address or estranged from families, which meant their disappearances often went unreported for days or even weeks. That delay gave Aleksandr time to continue without pressure. Another complication was the sheer size of Bitsa Park, covering more than 2,000 acres. Its mixture of woods, streams, and tunnels created hiding places that made consistent oversight impossible. Without direct evidence linking cases, authorities initially treated the murders as isolated events, crimes of opportunity in a city already dealing with high levels of violence. To Aleksandr, each success reinforced the idea that he could continue unchecked. Each body placed in the sewers became another claimed square on his mental chessboard. Unlike the first killing of his classmate, where he hesitated for years afterward, this new campaign came with no long pauses. Once he started, he continued steadily. The sewers period, as it would later be called, stretched across the early 2000s and claimed dozens of lives. Estimates differ, but law enforcement later suspected the real count far exceeded the number he was convicted for. What mattered to him was not the official number, but the ritual itself, an outward expression of control that he repeated again and again. The choice of the sewer drains as his disposal method also spoke to his understanding of the environment. Beneath the park ran more than just water. These tunnels connected to the infrastructure of Moscow itself, making them both accessible and difficult to patrol. By using them, he ensured that discovery would often happen long after the killing. When investigators did recover remains, decomposition and water damage erased vital forensic details. The system, already stretched thin, lacked the resources to unite these disjointed discoveries into a single investigation. For Aleksandr, the drains were perfect, discrete open mouths, ready to swallow evidence whole. Over the course of these years, fear spread in local whispers. Residents near the park noticed an unusual number of police patrols, yet few knew the reason. Some who were aware of the danger still dismissed it as sensational rumor, unwilling to believe that dozens of people could vanish so close to home. The park's daytime appearance as a safe public space covered the reality of its hidden role as a graveyard. In fact, that everyday normalcy may have protected him as much as his tactics did. So long as chessboards and families appeared in the park, the darker truth remained invisible to most. By the time authorities realized that clustering deaths pointed to something coordinated, Aleksandr's count had already soared. His acts displayed more consistency, more ritual. The hammer, the bottle, the sewer drains, and the grotesque post-mortem staging all pointed to a predator seeking not just to end lives, but to send messages. Though investigators would only fully grasp the scope later, the pattern was solidified. Bitsa Park, once known for picnics and weekend games, was by then almost a private hunting ground for a man who thought each victim was a move forward on his imagined chessboard. This period left a horrifying legacy. The survivors' testimonies, the dozens of missing, and the repeated discoveries of battered bodies eventually forced police to confront the possibility of an organized serial killer operating within Moscow. Yet at the time, connections came too slowly. That delay gave him freedom. The sewers period marked his transformation from hesitant teenage killer into a practiced predator. Aleksandr had not only resumed killing, He had refined it into a precise ritual of bait, strike, and disposal. He was no longer content to hide among the shadows. His methods grew clearer with every crime, but his methods would grow even more brutal. The killer turned from strangers to his own neighbors. For years, Aleksandr Pitšuškin had prowled the woods of Bitsa Park, looking for men who were off the radar, homeless wanderers, old pensioners, people who would not be missed right away. But by 2005, that changed. The murders moved into what investigators later called the open period, spanning from late 2005 into the summer of 2006. It was during this time that the brutality of his attacks deepened and the targets shifted uncomfortably close to his own home. For the first time, neighbors in the very apartment blocks where he lived became his victims. The change in method was immediate and striking. He now bludgeoned his victims over and over again, most often with a hammer. The repeated blows left wounds that made identification difficult and ensured death even if the first strike did not succeed. But what set these killings apart was not only the violence, but the ritual that followed. Pitšuškin inserted a vodka bottle directly into the skull wound, pushing it with deliberate force. For investigators, this was not just mutilation. It was a calculated act that transformed the scene into something symbolic. The gesture told them the murder itself was no longer enough. The statement made afterward became just as important to him as the life he had taken. Attacking from behind became his standard tactic in this period. This choice was less about chance and more about preservation. Striking from behind allowed him to keep his clothing clean, avoiding the splatter that might have stained his jacket or pants if he faced the victim directly. That detail mattered because it showed he was not acting in reckless passion. He thought ahead about how to escape, how to lower the risks of leaving obvious evidence on himself, and how to maintain control even beyond the killing. Such a precaution pointed to a man balancing brutality with method, reinforcing the sense of an offender who knew exactly what he was doing. Perhaps the most unnerving detail was where these crimes began to occur. 10 of his known victims during the open period lived in the same apartment complex where he himself resided, on Chersonskaya Street in Moscow. These were not strangers met in hidden corners of a park. These were men and women who lived in close proximity, people who would have seen him in stairwells, courtyards, or grocery shops. The idea that residents passed him daily, never knowing that he was plotting to kill people within the same blocks, added a chilling intimacy to this phase of his crimes. Imagine living in an apartment building where your neighbor smiled in the hallway, slipped past you in the stairwell, and carried groceries through the same doors while secretly staging murders nearby. That was the reality on Chersonskaya Street. The neighbors never suspected that one of their own was dragging acquaintances into wooded patches and bludgeoning them with hammers. Some victims were invited under ordinary pretenses, only to be led out and eliminated in the same way as his earlier targets. There was no warning sign for those who lived closest to him. The proximity of his crimes to his home signaled more than convenience. Criminologists who studied the case pointed out that serial offenders often begin with victims far away, then gradually draw closer as their confidence grows. By this phase, Aleksandr was emboldened. Killing near home reflected not only his faith in his ability to evade detection, but also the collapse of any inhibitions he may once have had. He had moved past the need for distance. Now he was willing to strike within walking distance of where he slept every night. This new intimacy also reflected a shift in compulsion. Killing was no longer simply about eliminating a victim. It was about staging a ritual. The insertion of vodka bottles was repeated across cases, not just once or twice. Each killing became less about practical concealment and more about reinforcing a routine he could control. The ritual itself grew to carry as much meaning as the act of murder. For Pitšuškin, domination did not end when life left the body. The deliberate bottle insertion made sure his power stretched beyond death. It was his mark, one the authorities could not ignore. The repeated blows to the head also spoke to this transition. Unlike earlier killings where a single strike might suffice, the pounding he unleashed during this time suggested excess. He wanted certainty, but also spectacle. Investigators later noted that the excessive hammer strikes went beyond necessity. They pointed to rage interlocked with ritual. Each swing amplified not only the death, but the reinforcement of his control. Victims were depersonalized, turned into objects for him to use as proof of his dominance. The bodies themselves became evidence of a performance his victims had no choice in. The neighbors on Chersonskaya remained unaware of what was happening until after his arrest. They described him in later interviews as quiet, someone who kept to himself, even helpful at times. They had no idea 10 of their own community were taken in just months. This gap between what they saw and what was actually happening behind the facade revealed another layer of his escalation. He felt so confident that he could carry on killing while exchanging everyday pleasantries with those around him. That confidence, however, came with overreach. It blinded him to the risks. By June of 2006, the open period had made his pattern too distinctive to ignore. Authorities already suspected that the hammer attacks paired with bottles signaled a single offender. 10 victims from his home complex tied the crimes together in a way that would later help investigators close in on him. In trying to prove his power through ritual, he had left a lasting imprint that mapped his actions more clearly than ever before. His willingness to kill so close to home became, ironically, the very overconfidence that exposed him in the end. This phase captured the unsettling evolution of Aleksandr Pitšuškin. From random wanderers in the shadows of Bitsa Park, he had now turned to neighbors who passed his door each day. He had escalated his force, invented a ritual, and crossed the boundary between his private residence and his public hunting grounds. His killings had become intimate, personal, and filled with signs of his arrogance. What once was hidden had begun to creep into his daily life. But his confidence soon caused a fatal mistake. In the end, it was a single scrap of paper that betrayed him. For years, Aleksandr Pitšuškin had killed in shadows and hidden his victims in the ground and sewers of Bitsa Park, careful to cover his trails. But with the death of Marina Moskalyova, his carefully controlled system began to crack. One small item she carried with her before her final walk would unravel everything. In her purse at the time of her death was a metro ticket. That ticket, stamped with the date and station, became the cornerstone that investigators used to link her movements directly to him. Marina had done something else before heading into Bitsa Park that night. She left a note for her family, telling them where she was going and mentioning Aleksandr by name. At the time, it was a small detail, almost casual, but it gave police a lead earlier victims never had. Most of those who died in the park were isolated or socially disconnected. Marina, however, had family who noticed her absence quickly and had evidence of her last steps. Her note mattered. When combined with the metro ticket, it provided a trail that could be followed. Investigators traced that stamp on the ticket back into the Moscow metro network. At each station, surveillance cameras recorded streams of passengers moving through hallways and platforms. It was not easy work. Hours of footage had to be combed through, frame by frame. But when police spotted Marina's image, walking alongside Pitšuškin on camera, it changed everything. The video showed them together entering the metro, confirming they had travelled side by side hours before her death. This was the first direct evidence linking him to a victim so close to the time of her murder. For police, it was a breakthrough. Up until that point, much of the evidence was circumstantial. Bitsa Park was vast, with many disappearances that could not easily be tied together. The hammer killings had a pattern, but without eyewitnesses or conclusive proof, files stayed open with little progress. Marina's ticket changed all that. Now they had documentation. Her note, her ticket, and her image alongside Pitšuškin. Investigators could point to more than rumours or coincidences. They had solid evidence placing him at her side shortly before she was killed. When Marina's body was recovered in the park, her injuries left little doubt about who was responsible. The blows to her skull, the impact marks from behind, and the unmistakable insertion of a vodka bottle were all consistent with the established pattern. Forensic specialists confirmed that these injuries matched the same method seen in earlier deaths. To detectives, this connection meant only one thing. They were not dealing with separate crimes. This was the work of the same man, and Marina's metro ticket confirmed his identity. Once enough evidence stacked up, police moved in to arrest him. He did not resist. Taken into custody, Aleksandr Pitšuškin faced hours of interrogation. What followed stunned even experienced investigators. Instead of denial or evasive claims, he began to speak. He described the murders not only in detail but in sequence, walking officers through the events like a man turning pages of a diary. His memory of the victims was remarkable. He recalled how they looked, what they wore, where they fell, and how he disposed of them. It was as if each crime had been burned into his mind. Under Russian procedure, it is common to conduct crime scene reenactments, where suspects recount events in the presence of investigators and camera crews. Pitšuškin participated willingly. He walked with officers back into Bitsa Park and retraced his crimes. On tape, he showed how he approached his victims, how he struck them, and how he dragged their bodies toward the sewer shafts. These demonstrations were chilling, not because of drama, but because of how matter-of-fact he appeared. He displayed no visible shame or hesitation in explaining how the victims were killed. Investigators noted how he described each victim as though he were replaying a chess game. He did not falter when recalling movements, directions, or methods. He could account for bodies left in shafts years earlier, as if he had committed the act only days before. To those watching, it was clear that this was not someone who stumbled through impulses. He remembered his crimes because, to him, they were structured events, each like a move on the board he imagined for himself. The level of detail provided credibility to his claims. While not all of the bodies he spoke about could be recovered or confirmed, the knowledge he held of places and methods matched evidence already on record. In some cases, he directed police to remains that had been overlooked. Each discovery reinforced that his words were not empty exaggerations. He had indeed killed many of those he claimed. His participation in the reenactments, filmed and preserved in the official record, gave prosecutors clear material to present later during trial. As the interrogations continued, police realized they had finally cornered the man who had eluded them for more than 14 years. The killings in Bitsa Park had masked themselves among unsolved disappearances, but Marina Moskalyova's murder exposed the hidden predator. Her metro ticket, a simple scrap of paper, led police step by step toward the truth. Combined with the forensic consistency in her injuries and the clear video evidence, the case was airtight. This time, there would be no release for lack of evidence. The impact of his arrest went beyond the immediate investigation. The scope of the murders he described forced the public and law enforcement alike to confront how one man had operated under their noses for so long. Each square on his imagined chessboard represented another life, and many of those squares had already been filled. Now, with him in custody, investigators could finally put the fragmented pieces together and shape a full picture. His openness in describing his crimes raised more chilling questions. What drove him to remember every detail so clearly? Why did each victim seem like a record to him rather than a tragedy? The answers to those questions emerged in his later confessions, when he explained what killing meant to him personally and why he compared himself to a god deciding life and death. But his own words were perhaps even more disturbing. What drove him to keep killing again and again? That was the question raised once Aleksandr Pitšuškin sat in custody and began to talk. For law enforcement, the details he described were beyond anything they expected. The scale shocked them, but it was his reasoning that left the strongest impression. He claimed that every killing gave him something essential, something that he could not obtain in any other way. In his own words, he explained, "In all cases I killed for only one reason. I killed in order to live, because when you kill, you want to live." For him, the act of ending another person's life was not simply destruction, it became an act tied to his own survival. His statements to investigators pulled the curtain back on how he saw himself. Life, for him, was inseparable from murder. "For me, life without murder is like life without food for you," he said. He framed the killings as nourishment, as routine as eating, a need rather than a choice. To him, victims were not people with their own families and experiences. He reduced them to necessary pieces in a distorted process that he claimed sustained him. When he described his role, he used language of control and guardianship, even stating that he felt like the father of all these people, since it was me who opened the door for them to another world. The phrase revealed how far removed he was from empathy. He imagined himself as a provider of passage, elevating himself to a position of power nobody could question. Alongside these statements came his explanation of the chessboard. From the beginning, he tied his killings to the grid of 64 squares. Each murder, in his mind, filled a space. It turned what would otherwise be random violence into a calculation. This goal of aligning his acts with a board game reflected not just planning, but a desire for order. With 64 slots to complete, he saw murder as a structured challenge, a project to complete rather than a crime spree without direction. Law enforcement pointed out that the metaphor suited his personality. The game he once clung to in childhood had become a framework for murder, but he later contradicted himself, saying the board was only one part of the truth. During questioning, he admitted that 64 was not a limit after all. He told investigators that if not stopped, he would have continued killing indefinitely. His chess plan, as chilling as it sounded, was only a symbolic stage in the larger pursuit. This recantation made clear that he saw no natural endpoint. The killings were not constrained by the idea of a completed game or a fixed tally. Instead, they were an open-ended effort, with the only control being his own arrest. The acknowledgement reinforced just how deeply the act had fused with his identity. The public was disturbed not only by his crimes but by his self-image. In his mind, every attack placed him above the ordinary world. He equated himself to a god deciding who lived and who died. The investigators heard him describe his role in grandiose terms, as if he oversaw the boundary between life and death. This sense of supremacy is often noted in profiles of power-driven offenders. They find satisfaction not only in the act itself, but in the belief that they alone hold the authority to decide another's fate. Pitšuškin could not have stated this more clearly. As news of his confessions spread in Russia, the media quickly drew comparisons to earlier cases. The most frequent name raised was Andrei Chikatilo, known as one of the most notorious killers of the Soviet Union. The similarity of large body counts, the brutality of crimes, and the focus on vulnerable victims made the link inescapable for journalists. Reports presented Pitšuškin as a successor to that earlier figure, framing him as the next chapter in a grim narrative of Russian true crime. This comparison helped the public grasp the magnitude of his actions, but it also shaped how Aleksandr may have seen himself. Being named alongside Chikatilo turned him into part of a national story, and the attention meant his claims of significance were being amplified rather than ignored. Psychologists examining his case emphasized the role of control in his confessions. They noted that his statements reflected not only a craving for dominance, but also an effort to correct feelings of weakness he experienced earlier in life. The childhood brain injury, the bullying, and the rejection combined to leave him powerless. His killings became a way to swing that balance sharply in the other direction. By deciding over life and death, he placed himself at the peak of authority. Each confession he gave reiterated this need. He wanted the world to see just how precisely he remembered every detail, as if recounting moves in a match. Courts and media audiences alike saw how his recollections turned lives into statistics. But for him, they were badges of mastery. The contradictions in his explanations made him even more unsettling. On one hand, he insisted he had a clear vision, a structured aim tied to chess. On the other, he admitted that there would never have been an end, no finish line he would be content with. This tension suggested that the chessboard was never the true goal, only a flexible narrative. It gave reporters and authorities an image to attach to him, but in reality, the compulsion would have stretched far beyond that. His words proved as manipulative as the lures he offered his victims. He enjoyed constructing metaphors that elevated him, but beneath them lay the raw drive to kill again and again. When confronted with these accounts, the response from the wider public carried layers of outrage and disbelief. Many could not comprehend how someone could link nourishment to violence, or how he framed himself as a parental figure, sending others into another world. To ordinary citizens, it was repulsion. For psychologists, however, it laid bare the workings of someone with an unrestrained need for control, tied to an inflated self-image. He considered himself the vital force in the lives of the people he killed. Imagining their transitions as orchestrated by him alone, his confessions painted the clearest possible picture of who he was. He was not simply a man who killed out of desperation or passion. He was not random or opportunistic. He was systematic, self-styled, and obsessed with control. The descriptions he provided revealed a man hungry for significance, imagining that through murder he had carved out immortality. Each word turned the investigation into something more than an inquiry into crime. It was now an exploration of the way one man constructed an identity out of dominance. His people, as he called them, were victims reduced to lines in his distorted story. For investigators, the clarity was painful but also necessary. The confessions confirmed the scope, the mindset, and the utter absence of empathy. They presented not just a killer, but a profile of obsession, a man who tethered his existence to the destruction of others and called it life. Those words, preserved in record, remain a window into his mind for both law enforcement and psychologists. His trial brought the final judgment on his fate. The courtroom had to protect society from the defendant inside it. When Aleksandr Pitšuškin went on trial in Moscow in the year 2007, authorities made a decision that would shape how the public remembered him. They placed him in a transparent glass cage at the center of the room, separating him from the families of victims, the press, and even the court staff. It was not just a symbolic measure. Court officials feared that someone might try to attack him, and they also feared that he himself might lash out unpredictably. The glass cage became an image carried across Russian media, a reminder that both his crimes and his persona required extraordinary levels of control. The trial itself drew immense attention. Reporters filled the courtroom, and cameras captured every moment of the proceedings. Russia had dealt with serial killers before, but the scale of Pitšuškin's case made it a national spectacle. People who had followed rumors of the Bitsa Park maniac now learned the full scope of his violence. Not only did prosecutors present evidence from dozens of cases, but they also played tapes of his reenactments, where he calmly explained his methods. Every detail placed before the jury reinforced the calculated nature of what had taken place over 14 years. In October of that year, the panel of judges reached their decision. Aleksandr Pitšuškin was convicted of 49 counts of murder and 3 attempted murders. Though he often claimed he had killed far more, The conviction reflected only the cases supported by physical evidence and consistent testimony. This made him one of Russia's most prolific confirmed killers, though even in court, prosecutors acknowledged that the true toll could be higher. The conviction secured his place in Russia's criminal history books, and it left the court with the task of determining how to punish him. Judge Vladimir Usov delivered the sentencing with language that underscored the severity of the crimes. Pitšuškin was handed a life sentence, with an initial term of 15 years in solitary confinement. Under Russian law, life imprisonment in solitary stands among the harshest sentences possible. For the first decade and a half, he would be kept completely apart from other inmates, with limited human contact and restricted movements. The measure was designed not just to punish him, but to ensure he could not influence or harm others inside the prison system. Even after that period expired, he would never walk free again. Pitšuškin did not accept this outcome quietly. He appealed, claiming that the sentence was too harsh. He asked for it to be reduced to 25 years, a request that reflected how drastically he underestimated the response to his crimes. Russian courts rejected his petition without debate. The rejection confirmed what Judge Usov had established, that the scope of his murders and the cruelty of his methods placed him beyond the reach of leniency. The appeal only highlighted the contrast between his perception of himself and the reality of how the justice system and the public saw him. For the families of those he killed, the sentencing provided little comfort, but some measure of closure. Many attended the courtroom, sitting only feet away from the man who had taken their loved ones. The glass barrier ensured no violence could occur, but it also created a sense of distance, leaving relatives to stare at him like a specimen cut off from the world. Some called the sentence justice, while others felt it could never match the scope of the pain. Their presence, though, demonstrated the collective impact of dozens of lives ended without warning. The public reaction spread across Russia. News broadcasts replayed footage of him sitting calmly in the cage, sometimes smirking, other times silent. People described anger at the thought of how long he had operated without being caught. Fear too lingered, especially for Moscow residents who realized they had lived near a man killing in their parks and neighborhoods. At the same time, a level of fascination grew. Citizens who had no direct connection to the crimes were drawn to the mystery of how someone could carry out such acts. This mix of emotions, anger, fear, and curiosity turned the trial into one of the most watched court cases in recent Russian history. Over time, his case passed from breaking news into cultural memory. Writers published books about him, cataloguing his murders and reflecting on the investigation. Documentaries soon included his story among accounts of other well-known serial killers. Discovery's series Serial Killers chose his crimes as part of their first season, emphasizing how his game-like approach shocked audiences. Podcasts followed, each dissecting the details of Bitsa Park, his hammer, and his chessboard fixation. Shows like My Favorite Murder and That's Why We Drink dedicated entire episodes to his crimes, ensuring that even beyond Russia, his name became part of the international lore of serial murder. The fascination did not stem from sympathy, but from horror. People wanted to understand how an ordinary individual, living in an apartment block, could hide such atrocities. The cage in the courtroom became the lasting image, frozen in photos and video. In the years since, that image has symbolized the gulf between the ordinary neighbor people may pass on the street and the hidden predator capable of destroying dozens of lives. The contrast between mundane appearances and monstrous acts kept his story alive in popular culture. Even after the court handed down its ruling, people debated what made Pitšuškin different from others. Some emphasized his childhood injury, others stressed his isolation after his grandfather's death, and some focused on the ritualistic features of his killings. Whatever the cause, his trial stood as the turning point where rumor and speculation gave way to confirmed fact. No longer was he a nameless figure prowling the park. No longer was he a shadow in police reports. He was a convicted murderer, formally recognized as one of the most prolific in Russia. Justice, in his case, carried a particular irony. He had positioned himself as a godlike figure, recalling every detail of his killings as if they were deliberate moves in a match. Yet in court, instead of commanding life or death, he found himself enclosed in glass, restricted, his words no longer a declaration of authority but statements recorded into official records. His ability to command was gone. The cage reduced him to someone observed and controlled, not feared or revered. For him, that isolation was the reversal of every illusion he had created. Although the trial brought justice, it did not erase fascination. Each book, television program, and podcast ensured his name would remain in circulation, discussed not only in Russia, but abroad. For ordinary people, his case became a reminder that killers often hide in the most ordinary settings. Apartment blocks, metro stations, and city parks became linked forever to a man who exploited everyday places to cover deadly habits. Those final images from the courtroom, with him boxed in glass and destined for solitary, continue to serve as the ending chapter for the families and the opening line for those who would study or retell his story. Justice had been served, but fascination with his crimes would continue. Where is he now, nearly 2 decades later? Locked away in Russia's Arctic, Aleksandr Pitšuškin spends his days in freezing solitude. After his conviction in the year 2007, he was sent to one of the most remote and secure prisons in the country, a place known as the Polar Owl Penal Colony. Located deep in the northern regions, far from Moscow and any major settlement, the prison has a reputation for being one of the harshest institutions in Russia's penal system. The cold climate, the endless stretch of tundra, and the walls of steel and concrete make it a place where escape is not even a possibility. It was here the Russian courts decided the Chessboard Killer would serve the rest of his life. Unlike standard correctional facilities, the Polar Owl is designed for the state's most dangerous inmates. It is not only about serving time, but also ensuring that society is completely cut off from men who have already proved their capacity for violence. Pitšuškin's sentence began with 15 years of solitary confinement. That meant a single cell, day after day, with little human interaction and no chance to socialize with other prisoners. For him, who once spent years wandering Moscow's most crowded park hunting strangers, this existence represented the total opposite. Access to conversation, freedom of movement, even a simple sense of companionship, all were stripped away. The sentence reflected both punishment and prevention. In many ways, his isolation is both a safeguard and a statement. After claiming dozens of lives, he has now become invisible to the outside world. The prison restricts his movements and limits contact even within its secured walls. Records about his daily life are scarce, deliberately controlled by Russian authorities. Inmates at Polar Owl live under constant supervision, with routines that leave little room for variation. For nearly 2 decades, Pitšuškin has spent this existence in monotony. Each day is measured by the same narrow schedule. Visitors are rare. Communication with the outside is tightly restricted, often intercepted or monitored. Isolation serves as safety for others, but also highlights the eternal finality of his sentence. Information on his health and mental state is almost non-existent. Russian authorities rarely release data about the personal conditions of inmates at high-security facilities, and journalists have little access to this remote place. Sparse reports suggest he remains considered one of the most dangerous prisoners in the country, but concrete details about his current life are minimal. This silence itself is telling. In Bitsa Park, his crimes were visible in every detail of the crime scenes, each body left with a signature of domination. At Polar Owl, nothing leaves the walls. Official silence has turned him from a public predator into a figure consumed entirely by confinement. Even so, his name has not faded. The Chessboard Killer remains a subject of discussion in crime forums, podcasts, documentaries, and books. People still examine his case, compare his methods to other infamous killers, and speculate on his psychology. He remains a figure of fascination for those trying to understand the patterns of violent offenders. What makes his case stand out is how ordinary his life once appeared, and how extraordinary his crimes became. This continuing interest shows how criminals of his scale slip into a kind of infamy that persists long after capture. However, these conversations happen without him. Locked away in his icebound cell, Pitšuškin has no say in the way his story is now told. The contrast is stark. In the early 2000s, when he stalked Moscow's Bitsa Park, he moved among crowds. Families picnicked, dog owners walked, pensioners played chess, and within those ordinary activities he found victims. Thousands of people passed daily through the places he hunted. His crimes occurred in busy urban life, often steps away from unsuspecting citizens. Today, that life of constant interaction is gone. Where once he wandered among people in city parks, he now spends each day locked in Arctic solitude, watched by guards rather than neighbors. The shift from public predator to isolated inmate emphasizes the finality of his conviction. In June of the year 2025, authorities denied his request to transfer to a facility closer to Moscow. He wanted relocation, but officials refused. Staying at the Polar Owl reinforced the reality of his punishment. He would remain in the Arctic, far from family, far from attention, far from the city that for years provided both his hunting ground and his freedom. The refusal confirmed that his case demanded not only confinement, but distance. He would not live out his years in central Russia, where attention might surround him. He would instead continue on in silence, in an isolated cell cut off from any environment where recognition could fuel him. Descriptions of the polar owl emphasize the unforgiving nature of life there. Winter stretches across most of the year. The prison is built to resist the freezing winds and heavy snow, but the cold never disappears. Inmates have few comforts, and routines are enforced with military precision. For a man once known for wandering vast city forests, the tiny cell is a striking reversal. He cannot choose his path, his victims, or his strategy anymore. Every move is decided by the state, every hour governed by an authority he can no longer resist. He does not carry a chessboard in his cell. Instead, the rigid walls around him are the board now, and he has no pieces left to play. The life he leads today is one without theatre. No cameras record his reenactments. No investigators ask him to recount his methods. No neighbours unknowingly share his hallway. He is one of many prisoners locked out of sight in Russia's far northern reaches. Yet, his case maintains interest outside, where criminologists analyse his moves and storytellers retell his methods. The silence around him only deepens the intrigue. While he wastes days in confinement, the chessboard killer lives on in discussions he cannot hear. This outcome marks one of the sharpest reversals in Russian crime history. Once active in crowded Moscow, Aleksandr Pitšuškin now sits chained to icy isolation. His sentence ensures that his time will end not in another demonstration of control, but in the quiet monotony of a prison cell, thousands of miles away from the city streets where he thrived as a predator. For him, there will be no final move, no chance to claim another square. His game ended long ago, leaving him with nothing but the empty hours of imprisonment. In this way, his story ends not with glory, but locked in silence. His life inside the polar owl penal colony shows the finality of justice: extreme isolation, endless cold, and zero possibility of return to the world he once terrorized. His story leaves a troubling reminder about hidden predators.